and welcome to Herp A Derp, a podcast about breaking the stigma on herpes and empowering the community. I'm your host, Erin DeVos. As always, you can review my episodes on YouTube, Anchor, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find the link to the channel on the podcast's Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter page at Herp A Derp Podcast. Thanks! Hey, Herp A Derpers! This episode's gonna be a bit of a deep thoughts one. I feel like I haven't really done too much in the while in terms of really wanting to explore who we are in a sexual way. Like I did talk about, living life sexually and that we are able to really be able to express ourselves in the midst of the moment and, through hurt and pain, but also through happiness and pure joy that has come across in our lives. And I wanted to take a moment to kind of talk about what I had researched over these past few weeks, and that is the Kinsey Scale. And I have never been too familiar with the Kinsey Scale, so I kind of want to break it down for all of you, for those who are not familiar. First of all, and foremost, fact number one about it is that the Kinsey Scale is not an actual test. However, all are professionally designed personality tests meant for measuring heterosexual or homosexual behavior in relation to genders roles in the Western world. So just wanted to give you kind of that disclaimer about it. And to dive in, the Kinsey Scale is also called the Heterosexual Homosexual Rating Scale, and it's used to research to describe a person's sexual orientation based on one's experience or response at a given time. The scale typically ranges from 0, meaning exclusively heterosexual, to 6, meaning exclusively homosexual. And newsflash that, since the scale is not an actual test, this is all based on hours and hours of interviews, which I'll dive into. And the Kinsey Scale does not address all possible sexual identities, and does not purport accommodate respondents who identify as, non-binary. And contrary to popular belief, Kinsey was not a behaviorist, but granted that sexuality is more broader than a simply lived behavior. And kind of wrap that around, like, you aren't meant to come away from this guide or the scale thinking that the Kinsey is the only option for self-identifying who we are sexually. And if anything, questioning is a pretty valid way of determining how you feel about your own sexual identity, fluidity, attraction, and experience. But it's and it's been the basics of a queer identity since the 1950s. So, if nonetheless, consider this an important history lesson in early history of sexology and really trying to figure out where the scale is and what it really means. And here I had researched a few takeaways about the Kinsey Scale, and I'll name 6 for just a few. So the first, Alfred Kinsey created the scale in 1948 to study sexual behavior and open up about people's sex lives and fantasies when it comes to sex. So in a way, it was just the kind of that gateway to really be able to talk about it and not make this such a taboo way, even though it still was, and back then it was even considered that as well. It kind of opened the door to start having that type of conversation, which I find so interesting. And the second takeaway is, it may convince people it is seen as a scale than more than a spectrum, because, we have the LGBTQ plus community acronym. So kind of thinking of it as just, fluid, the scale In a way, like visually, we see these two parts to us, but when we see a spectrum, there's so much more to us, and I find that so fascinating. And number 3 leads right into that, is talking about the 6 different parts of the scale. So, fun facts. 0 means exclusively heterosexual or non-homosexual. Number 2 is predominantly heterosexual, only incidentally homosexual. Number 2, predominantly heterosexual, but more than incidentally homosexual. 3, equally heterosexual and homosexual, aka bi. Predominantly homosexual, but are more incidentally heterosexual. 5, predominantly homosexual, only incidentally heterosexual. And number 6, exclusively homosexual. So, just to give you a visual of what that scale looks like. And the 4th takeaway is the Kinsey Scale is fundamentally based on how many times in your life you feel or act in a sexual way towards one gender or another. And in a way, this kind of seen as a problem for people who want to identify bisexuality on the Kinsey Scale. Number 3, attracted in both ways, doesn't encompass the complexity of bisexual experience and invalidates people who feel more like the 2s or the 5s on the scale, but they still identify as bi. So it really puts you in that type of perspective, like what does bi really, really mean? And the 5th takeaway is there are other more complex scales out there. I did not want to get into them, but one of them that got to me the most was the Klein Sexual Orientation Grid. And this was developed by Fritz Klein, which is kind of one of the more complex continuums. It takes into account emotional preference, social preference, and lifestyle, and rates sexual attraction as separate from fantasies or sex itself, and includes how to define yourself and how you felt about your orientation over time, in the past, right now, and how you may feel in the future. It is a pretty cool grid. I do advise everyone kind of checking these out too. I think it's just really interesting how we really define sexuality, which brings me into my 6th and final point, that numbers on the scale can change, and that I firmly believe that sexuality is fluid, and it can change based on feelings and experiences with genders, just as the other examples I had described. And herpes, and you might be wondering again, like, what this has to do with herpes. And herpes, from my past experience with people, made me consider which gender I was really attracted to. It made me think that, if men continue to hurt me in the dating scene and like for them to not even tell me that I have herpes, that must mean I feel like I'm really into women, right? And, it may not necessarily be the case. And, as much as I can go on to talk about my experiences, life is all about experiences. And it is up to us to explore our bodies and with our bodies, who we are, and when people are comfortable to take sexual experiences with someone who is the same or opposite sex. And herpes diagnosis can make us, question our worth, which really kind of brings into, who we really are and like who we feel as we may be as a sexual being. And no one is as worthy as it is for you to be free in expressing yourself and the one who you're really into. So really, take that into mind. Think of the Kinsey Scale, like, yes, it's just a scale, but ultimately it comes down to like who you're into and what you love to do and what genders you're into. So definitely it's something I kind of was curious about. Call me bi-curious in this case, but wanted to really share and get your thoughts on that. As always, feel free to share or comment on this podcast episode through YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or email at herpaderpodcast@gmail.com. Anchor listeners can now leave voicemail messages after listening to the podcast episode to get those deep reflections. It's super fun to do and share your thoughts.